joining us now is S.I. Rosenbaum. S.I. is a journalist and artist. She's written for New York Magazine and other publications, including the Boston Globe and Boston Magazine. And she recently did a piece on Poynter.org, which is a Poyntr, which is a journalism website, on what journalists don't understand when they talk about Social Security disability insurance. And having covered that story a little bit myself, I know, S.I., you could have written a book about that. But first of all, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And tell us, if you would please, just in a few words, what it is you think journalists are getting wrong and what led you to write about this in the first place.
I think that in general, a lot of people in America don't know a lot about the experiences of people with disabilities. It's not something that a lot of non-disabled people think about or like to think about. And there are a lot of assumptions that people make about disabled people and about disability. One of the things that people tend to assume is that people with disabilities naturally have sad and curtailed lives. So that when you encounter somebody who's disabled and poor, well, that's just kind of how it is. But then there's a counter stereotype that being on disability, being on government aid for disability is easy to sign up for, easy to get, and you just kind of coast along with your sad disabled life. And I think that a lot of journalists share these prejudices. They share these assumptions. So when we find ourselves doing a story about someone who's disabled, we don't ask what the circumstances of that person's life are. We don't ask what their career options are. We don't ask what the financial limits imposed upon them are if they're receiving government aid. And because we don't ask these basic questions, we end up reporting stories that are incomplete and misleading to readers and often grossly unfair to our sources. So, that's kind of the underlying situation here, I think.
Yeah, I think that's extremely well said, actually. And I guess I would just say, I want your thoughts on it, that whole issue of Social Security disability insurance unfortunately lies at the intersection of two areas of myth-making and misguided belief in our culture. You eloquently described how that myth-making affects the public's or some people's view of the disabled. And in addition, we're talking about finance and social insurance, which is a whole other area where a lot of people, including many journalists, are ill-informed. And as you point out, for example, in your piece, Social Security disability insurance is means tested. You have to prove.
No, actually, Social Security disability insurance isn't means tested. It's confusing. Social Security disability insurance is one type of aid, and then SSI, I think it stands for supplemental security insurance, supplemental something income. SSI is separate from SSDI. SSDI is a form of Social Security that you receive the same way you receive Social Security when you're old. It's for people who become disabled, who have worked and paid into the system, and they're getting that money back. So it's not means tested. SSI is a form of social aid for people who are disabled who haven't worked enough to receive SSDI. So that's people who became disabled in childhood, people who were born with congenital disabilities, and people who became disabled as adults but hadn't worked enough hours to receive SSDI. And SSI is means tested, which means that to receive it, you have to meet very strict income and asset requirements. Generally speaking, you have to have less than $2,000 to your name. Your home and one vehicle are exempt, but everything else is not. All of your savings accounts can't add up to more than $2,000 at any time. And your income has to be very low also. It's something along the lines of $735 a month. And if your income is to go up for any reason, then your SSI income goes down.
Right.
A lot of people
absolutely.
are on SSI. The requirements are that you have to be poor to receive it, you have to stay poor.
Yeah. And my confusion was what I meant to say was that you have to qualify for both programs. You have to prove your disability.
You have to qualify for both programs, correct, and you have to continue qualifying. You have to recertify that you're disabled every year.
Right. And the other thing that I think people don't understand about SSI and SSDI, about these two forms, is that Social Security disability insurance, you pay for that. That's the kind that you have to have worked a certain amount to get. You've actually paid for that, and that's why you don't have to meet the low income and low asset requirements, because it's a form of social insurance.
Yes, although there are other. I've been told that there are other requirements for SSDI. For example, if you work and you earn too much, you might be declared no longer disabled, and you might lose that. So there are other catch-22s for SSDI as well.
Yeah, but qualification, and I assume I think the logic there is that that's a way of testing that you no longer need the insurance that you paid for. That's one way to look at it, because you're able to work, and the insurance is for when you can't work full time or et cetera. So I think it is important for people to understand, because I think when people talk about Social Security in general, which is also paid for throughout your working life, I think people don't understand that some benefits are welfare programs. They're legitimate. They're for people who need them, but they are for people who've fallen, who are in need, economic need. Other programs, while they're far from generous in this country, they're paid for by the people who collect them, like
Absolutely.
your car insurance, right?
Yeah, that's a benefit that you've paid into, correct? It's not a handout.
No, it's not a handout at all. And in an ideal country, world, I guess we would not even consider a handout a handout. It's assistance to people who need it, but that is the way we think. So, S.I. Rosenbaum, so you wrote about a piece in the Washington Post that's gotten a lot of attention in this particular community, but tell us a little bit about that Washington Post piece, if you don't mind.
The Washington Post piece, 4 Generations on Disability. This was part of a series the Post is doing on disability aid and the amount of people who are receiving disability. It was a profile of a family in Missouri. Apparently, 4 generations of this family have been, quote unquote, on disability. That's the only term used in the article. The article doesn't mention the terms SSI or SSDI. It doesn't explain how those two things work. I don't know which of those two programs, if either, the different members of the family have been on, because that wasn't mentioned in the story. It's very writerly. It's a narrative feature, and it's mostly anecdotal. Shows the family attempting to apply for benefits that have been denied for their 2 children, and it doesn't really do anything to explain to readers how these programs work, what it means to be on them, or what the implications of that are. There's a lot of discussion of how many poor people in the country are on disability, but there's no explanation about how some of those programs that we call being on disability actually require the recipients to be poor. And the reason why that's relevant is that for a lot of people with disabilities, the only insurance that they can get is Medicaid, and Medicaid might also be the only program that provides healthcare devices and services that they need to survive. Medicaid also has similar asset and income restrictions. So in order to receive Medicaid, you also have to be poor. So a lot of people who become disabled later in life find that rather than being able to pay for the benefits that they need to survive day to day, they actually have to spend down all of their assets, quit their job, so that they can qualify for Medicaid, which will provide those services that they otherwise could not afford to pay for out of pocket, and which otherwise wouldn't be covered by ordinary insurance. So I feel like if you're going to discuss poverty and disability and the relationship between those two things, I think it's very important to understand the ways in which different kinds of disability aid kind of trap people in poverty. So it's not so much that many poor people have chosen to go on disability. It's also that many disabled people are required to be poor. None of this is discussed in the article, and I feel that this is kind of a major hole in the story. When I contacted Washington Post to talk to them about this, they told me that the story was not about Medicaid, it wasn't about insurance, it was just about what it's like for this family to be on disability and what it's like to be on disability in the U.S. But I don't think you can really discuss those things separately. And I really wish that they had been able to delve into that. I'm not sure if they decided that it wasn't relevant to the story or if they simply didn't ask the questions. I think it's the latter, which disturbs me even more than the other option, frankly. I think reporters often don't know to ask these questions, but if you do understand these relationships between aid programs and disability and poverty, and you choose not to include them in the story, then that kind of compounds that error to me.
Yeah, and
it does a disservice to readers.
Yeah, and I might be, S.I. Rosenbaum, I might be even a little harsher than you've been in the sense that, and you write...
Go right ahead.
you write very fair-mindedly that in your piece, in writing this critique, I don't mean to pillory McCoy, the writer, or his editor, so allow me for a second. I think that when we as journalists present a story without the proper context and leave the reader with a distinct and strong impression based on an anecdotal storytelling, which in this case, by the way, I thought was quite, as prose, was well written, well executed. But when we do that, whether it is a family on disability or a so-called welfare queen claiming multiple accounts, if the reader comes away with the wrong impression, let's say, in the infamous welfare queen story of the 1980s, that there were all sorts of people doing this and that welfare rolls were filled with abusers and so on. But whatever the story, and I'm not meaning to say, by the way, that this story was at that level, but whenever we do not provide proper context, whenever we do not look at the totality of the experience of the people living through this, whenever we allow readers to put our piece down or walk away from our piece with a misguided impression, we've failed to do our jobs. What do you think of that interpretation?
I agree with that. And I think, even giving the benefit of the doubt that this was the story that they wanted to tell, I think that we choose the stories that we tell. We don't tell every story. And I think that, there's ethics to which story we choose to tell as well. If you can always find an example of people who are irresponsible. You can always find an example of people who aren't using the system the way they should. But I don't think that represents the majority of people. And I don't think that they did a service to this family or to their readers by choosing a story that leaves readers with the impression that this is a widespread abuse of a system that is actually, I think the real story is that the system is actually kind of inadequate in serving the people that it needs to serve, and the services that it provides are not extras. These are human rights: the right to be able to not starve to death if you're disabled, the right to be able to get out of bed and become a member of society and have access to the community. These are human rights. So I do think that this did a disservice to readers. I think it's and the thing is, though, I want to stress that this isn't an isolated incident, either at the Post or at other newspapers. And a day doesn't go by when you don't see a story about people with disabilities that that doesn't share these same assumptions and prejudices. So this is a systemic failing throughout journalism, I think, and it's a place where, as journalists, I think we're used to coming to a story from a place of ignorance and then asking questions. And I think when it comes to disability, often as journalists, we think we know more than we do, and we don't ask the questions that we need to ask.
Well, I think that's very well said. And as you wrote in your piece, when we do this, we do our readers a disservice, and in this case, we do the disabled a disservice as well. So S.I. Rosenbaum, journalist and artist, thanks so much for writing this piece, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me. I think this is an important story, and I hope that a lot of people pay attention to it.
Well, we will.